All right, first of all, a quick review of just a couple of points. Remember, viruses are made out of two main things. Protein coat, called the capsid on the outside, and either DNA or RNA on the inside, not both. They're also going to have a few enzymes associated with their DNA or RNA. That's basically it. Protein, nucleic acid. The other thing that I will quickly review with you, the life cycle of a virus is called the lytic cycle. And we know that the way viruses work, they first attach to a cell, usually using a receptor for some kind of solute. Once they attach, they inject either their DNA or their RNA into the host cell. The machinery of the cell then will do whatever that piece of DNA says to do. Typically, that's to make more viruses. So that's called biosynthesis. Step 4, those pieces get put together by the host cell. And finally, step 5, you get what's called release, or sometimes it's called lysis. And sometimes thousands of viruses can come out of that one, hundreds of thousands. That's the lytic cycle. Remember also, some viruses, a few, like herpes virus, like the shingles chickenpox virus, they can actually, their DNA can become part of the host cell's DNA and basically not cause any symptoms for long periods of time. And every time that host gets replicated, so does the virus DNA. When it's in that form, the viral DNA is called the prophage, which literally means before eating, right? Because in this setup, it's not really causing any symptoms. But if something goes on with the host immune system, maybe it gets sick with something else, maybe cancer, maybe HIV, maybe just stress, that can trigger this virus to go from this basic hibernating lysogenic stage back into the lytic cycle. And it can cycle in and out of lytic, back into lysogenic, back into lytic, over and over and over again. Yes. I haven't, but I will. Thank you. You have a sheet of paper? You mind signing and sending one around? All right, Kari's going to send around a sign-in sheet. I forgot to do that. Not exactly sure what my computer's doing there. Yeah. All right, mostly what we're going to talk about today, though, are bacteria. There's been some recent changes in the way they classify bacteria. First of all, there's now a group bigger than the kingdom. And what is that group called? What classification group is above kingdom? You guys all in regular biology talk about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? What's a bigger group than a kingdom now? This hadn't been that. This is not this new. I know you talked about it in regular biology. It's called the domain. The domain. There are 3 of those domains now. How many kingdoms? It depends on which classification system you look at, but typically there's about 6 kingdoms: animal, plant, fungus, and then it's kind of weird the way the others get divided up. But the domains, there are 3 domains. These are the biggest groups. One of them is the group we're about to talk about, eubacteria. The other is called archaea. Now this used to have archaeobacteria. Just recently, they decided that they're fairly unrelated to other bacteria. And they don't put the word bacteria on the end anymore. So it's just archaea. And then what's the other domain? Which domain are you a part of? Don't just full of answers this morning. You are a part of the domain eukarya, which means guess what? All what? eukaryotes. So this would include not only animals, it would also include plants, fungus, protists. And these are just bacteria-like organisms in the top two. All right, but right now we're going to talk just about eubacteria for a minute. We'll talk about just general characteristics of eubacteria. First of all, they're prokaryotic. No membrane-bound nucleus. They do have some DNA, and typically how much? How much DNA in a prokaryotic cell? One what? Single circular chromosome. And occasionally they have some extra little bitty loops of DNA, which are called what? What are the extra small pieces of DNA they can swap back and forth called? Plasmids. We'll talk about those here in just a second. Remember, they don't have membrane-bound organelles, none of those. They do have ribosomes, which are important for obviously for making proteins. Their genetic material, instead of being called the nucleus, since it's not separated from the rest of the cell by a membrane, it's called nucleoid. Their cells have a wall, which I skipped a second ago. And eubacterial walls are made of a pretty distinct chemical called peptidoglycan. Part sugar, part protein. And the walls there are mostly to protect them from what? What do walls mostly protect cells from? Bursting, from water pressure, turgor pressure. It's also can block certain things from getting into the cell, but mostly it's there for water. Some bacteria are also surrounded by what's called a glycocalyx or a capsule. This is basically like a mucus coating. And we talked about this in the last session. Why would a bacteria need a coating of mucus on the very outside? Partly to keep it from drying out, to keep water in. What's another reason? Protection from immune systems of hosts that it might get into. Also may help it to move, like slide, slick mucus. And then it also can help it to stick to surfaces. Sometimes mucus coatings can be kind of sticky. Speaking of that, let's talk about these next little things called pili. Pili are hair-like extensions that come out of the surface of the cell. They look a lot like cilia. Cilia are used for what? Movement. These aren't. These have two main uses. Most of the time what they're used for is they're sort of like bacterial Velcro that help to attach to other surfaces. That's their most common use. But the other use is this. Most of the time, how do bacteria reproduce? Binary fission, also called, up here, prokaryotic fission, which is what kind of reproduction? Asexual. There's the good and the bad of asexual reproduction. What's the good side of it? The biggest thing is it's fast. It's not necessarily a perfect copy because the DNA still got to be replicated. Right? There could be mutations. The biggest benefit, it's fast. You don't have to search for a mate, that kind of thing. When would it make sense to do asexual reproduction? In an environment that you're highly adapted for, that's not what? If you're living in an environment that you're highly adapted for and it's not changing, that's when asexual reproduction makes sense. If you've already evolved to be good at living in that environment, and that environment's nice and stable, makes sense, just keep on going. But asexual reproduction limits your ability to what? Have genetic variation, and therefore your ability to evolve. So when the environment's bad, when things get rough, sexual reproduction is pretty important because the whole purpose of sex, sexual reproduction in general, is to give us more different versions of what? Genes. It's to increase our genetic variation. If some kind of really bad version of the flu was to come along, it might kill a lot of us. But is it probably going to get all of us? You know, why is it probably not going to get all of us? Some of us probably have some weird little mutation that's going to make us very resistant to it. Here's an important point about mutations. If it got really cold, like a global cooling, and all power went off, like in that movie, like in that TV show Revolution, and I'm thinking, hey, it would be really cool if I had a coat of fur. Can I just up and grow a coat of fur? No. Mutations are not something that happen on purpose, right? What causes mutations? How do mutations happen? They're accidents, they're typos, they're random. But the thing is, humans have been around a long time. There's been a lot of random mutations. And a lot of those random mutations are just sitting there, not helping you, not hurting you. But if some weird virus comes along, there's a chance that some of us are probably going to be resistant to it. Like with HIV, there's proof that certain people are completely resistant to it. You could take a syringe of an HIV virus and inject them with it, they will get sick. That's what sex is all about. Sex is about mixing up the genes of two different people, creating a new person with a different combination of genes, keeping our gene pool, our whole group of genes, varied, so that if something comes along, we'll be able to evolve and adapt for it. Okay, a couple other things. Bacteria come in three main shapes. There's other variations, but three main ones. What are they? There you go. Coccus is just a sphere. One that looks kind of like a capsule, sometimes it's said to be ride-shaped, is a bacillus. And just a little spiral, little squiggly-like shape, that's called a spirillum. And then something I don't think we talked about the other day that we need to mention this time. Let's say that this is a bacterial cell. And here's his little chromosome in here. And the environment is getting bad. Something's going on in the environment. Maybe it's getting cold, maybe it's getting hot, maybe there's some kind of antibacterial chemical in the environment. The environment's going bad. What can this bacteria do to protect itself? Maybe, but that's not where I'm going just yet. Some bacteria have the ability to make what are called endospores. What do we know endo means? Inside. You kind of know what a spore is, right? But let's say the environment's going bad. These bacteria basically will make a hard coat around their genetic material. The cell dies. This hard coat hangs around. It's resistant to cold. It's resistant to hot. It's resistant to chemicals. So that once the environment gets better, what happens to that coating around that DNA? It dissolves, and the cell grows back, a new version of the cell with the same genetic material. So there are some bacteria. Let's see. Yep, I'm on now. Thank you. Anyway, back to what I was saying. There are some bacteria that are really hard to kill because of these endospores. Again, when the environment gets bad, make a coat around the DNA, die, essentially, and then when the environment gets better, grow back. There are lots of eubacteria that can do that kind of thing. One thing that I just skipped was talking about pili for a minute. asexual and sexual reproduction. We said that most of the time bacteria reproduce asexual, binary fission, split in two. But occasionally, because of this need for variation, two bacteria will get together and literally hook up. Now what I mean there is there's some specialized pili that actually will connect these two bacteria. It's like, almost like a straw, a tunnel between them. Now we said that we know that they both have just one chromosome. That'd be hard to switch, right? It'd be hard to swap. But what they do have out in their cytoplasm are these little bitty extra tiny, tiny loops of DNA called plasmids. And what they can do during this process of hooking together is they can swap some of those. They can swap, like this one might go over here. This one might go over here. They're swapping DNA. That's basically a form of what? Sex. That's bacterial sex. Because what they're doing is when they separate, what do you got? When they separate, you don't make any new bacteria. When you started with two, you're still going to end with two. But the two you have at the end are what? Genetically different than the two you started with. And like we said before, the purpose of sex is to create genetic variability, genetic variation.
Is this called anything?
It's called conjugation. This is called conjugation. What's conjugate mean? Just in general English usage, what does conjugate mean? Get together. Get together. You've heard of like prison conjugal visits before, right? You know what that is? Never mind, man. I won't go there. Won't go there. You can figure it out, though. You can figure it out. Conjugation, getting together. It's not what you're thinking, no. We won't go there. All right, last couple of things I'll mention about eubacteria. There are lots of human diseases caused by bacteria, obviously. Strep throat, which you probably all had at some point in time or other. That can be really bad, right? Strep throat can cause some serious issues. There is a form of strep called strep A. Have you ever heard of strep A, streptococcus A? Probably better known to some of you as flesh-eating bacteria. Heard of that before? If you get an infection of this, it can literally start to eat your limbs and wherever it may be on your body or weight. This is what killed, he had a different version. He had the lung version of strep A. Jim Henson, the Muppet guy, he died of strep A infection. Can be pretty serious stuff. Tetanus, better known to a lot of people as locked jaw. Causes your muscles to lock up. Not just the ones in your jaw, but that's a symptom, the ones in your jaw. A lot of people think you get that from what? Rusty nails. I'm going to tell you the rusty nail didn't have a whole lot to do with it. It's just where the bacteria that cause this like to live in rusty places, rusty, dirty places. But it's a bacterial infection. Syphilis, the STD, obviously caused by bacteria, therefore treatable with what? Pneumonia. Not all forms of pneumonia are bacterial, but the most common ones are. And maybe one that I should have put up here that I didn't. That's one of the diseases that's killed more humans than most. Anybody think of a bacterial disease that I left off here that's killed lots and lots of pieces? Well, that's not the one I was thinking about, but the bubonic plague, Black Death, bacterial. Still around. Spanish flu is a virus. TB, tuberculosis, still around, still killing people. And what's kind of scary about TB right now? It's become so resistant to antibiotics that there are very few antibiotics that will treat TB anymore. It continues to evolve and mutate. A few years ago, there was a student at Madison County High that got TB. Which is kind of scary because it's fairly transmittable by coughing and stuff like that. But the health department actually came out and gave that student her medicine and stayed there until they watched her take it every day. So that tells you it's pretty serious. Somebody comes from town, gives the kid the medicine, and waits till the kid swallows the medicine before they leave. Pretty serious stuff. So tuberculosis is a lung infection. Fairly easy to spread. Even though we mentioned all these bacterial diseases, by far, bacteria are more good than bad. Most bacteria are harmless, and actually most are helpful to us. They got a lot of positive things they do. The most important thing is decomposition. Breaking down biomass, breaking down dead stuff. And oftentimes we'll talk about how that they're mineral recyclers. Or they do mineral cycling. And when things die, there's all kinds of good stuff in those dead bodies. Nutrients, sodium, potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium. There's all kinds of minerals that need to be reused. A lot of the minerals in you right now might have used to been in a rat or something really disgusting. A worm, or all these things have been used over and over and over and over again. Literally, some of the chemicals in your body might have been part of Abraham or Moses, or because all those pieces have been recycled for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. And bacteria are one of the main reasons that can happen, because they decompose and the stuff eventually goes back into the ground or back into the water, so it can be reused over and over and over again. Yeah.
Does that mean that they can be dinosaurs?
You are part of what you're made out of might have been in dinosaurs at some point in time or other. Yes. All right, another important thing that I want to mention is something called the nitrogen cycle. There's a lot of nitrogen on Earth. Where's most of it at? In the air. Most of it is N2, nitrogen gas. Like 70% of every breath you take is N2. But it turns out that nitrogen in the air, most things cannot use. And that in the ground, there's not that much nitrogen. Why can't most things use the nitrogen out of the air? What kind of bond holds those two nitrogens together? Look at where nitrogen's at in the periodic table. It's in column 5. Which means those two nitrogens to stick together have to form what kind of bond? Well, a covalent, but what kind of covalent bond? A triple, because they have to share 3 pairs of electrons apiece, right? So a covalent triple bond. Triple bonds are really, really strong, really, really hard to break. And it's even harder because nitrogen is what kind of atom? Well, it is electronegative. That doesn't have a lot to do with this, though. It's really small, which means that triple bond is very close to 2 nuclei. So it's really, really hard to break. It's held on to really tight. Most things can't do it, which means there's not a lot of nitrogen in the ground. Why do we need nitrogen? From class yesterday, those of you that were in A classes. Why do we need nitrogen? Well, plants need it to grow, but we need it too. All animals, all plants need it, because nitrogen is an important component of what? What 2 really important chemicals in your body? DNA, nitrogenous bases, right? A, T, G, C. Well, what we've been talking about in class the last couple of days, the nitrogen is an important part of. What was the main topic of yesterday's discussion in the day class? Amino groups, amino acids. What does amino mean? Nitrogen. Okay? Nitrogen. We need it for proteins. And we know proteins are hugely, hugely important. Okay? So most things can't can't use this nitrogen out of the air. Nitrogen is rare in the ground. Bacteria, some bacteria, have the ability to take that nitrogen out of the air and do what's called nitrogen fixation on it. Which means they take that nitrogen and they break that bind. They have enzymes that will allow them to do that. And they turn it into a form that plants and animals can use. When you use nitrogen, and plants use it, what form is that nitrogen typically in? What form of nitrogen can plants and animals use? Not liquid nitrogen. That's not really cold, right? You usually use it in the form of an ion. There's two common ion forms of nitrogen that you might use. One of them is this one. What do we call that? NO3 minus 1. Nitrate. And the other one, that, which is not ammonia, it's what? Ammonium ion. Nitrate or ammonium ion, yes.
Question. Now, why is it when cotton's growing that we inject liquid nitrogen into the ground?
It's not liquid nitrogen. It's these ions dissolved in water. It's not liquid nitrogen like the cold liquid nitrogen. It's liquid ion forms of nitrogen. Different thing. Different thing. Point being, though, the bacteria can take this nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a form useful for plants and animals. Where do a lot of these bacteria that can do this live? A lot of them live on the roots of plants. They live in a symbiotic relationship, particularly on what kinds of plants? A lot of them are like bean plants, soybeans, a lot of bean, legume kinds of plants, beans in general. Anybody ever seen the roots of a soybean plant? What do they look like? Jacob, what you seen? What looks weird about it? No, there's something different about soybean roots.
Fibrous?
They are fibrous, but what's like growing on them though? Their roots look like normal roots, except they've got these little, what looks like little tumors growing on them. They're little circles, they look like tumors all over the roots. Guess what those are? They're called nodules, but they're basically bacteria houses. The plant has basically grown these little hotels for these bacteria. Bacteria are living on the roots in these little hotels. They're taking nitrogen out of the air, converting it into a form that the soybeans can use. What else is the soybean providing for the bacteria so that they'll hang around and help them out? What's the soybean plant got plenty of since it's a plant? Sugar. Plant can do photosynthesis, right? So the bacteria provide the nitrogen. The soybean plant provides a home and food, sugar. So it's a mutualistic kind of relationship. It's a good deal for both. So this is part of the nitrogen cycle. Plants will use this. Animals will eat the plants. That's how we get our nitrogen. There are other bacteria in the ground that will take these ions and do, guess what? Different kind of bacteria will convert it back. That's why it's called the nitrogen cycle. How have we kind of screwed up this cycle in some ways? What have we done to sort of mess it up? Yeah, but what do we make that has to do with this? We now know how to make artificial what? Yeah, we call that fertilizers. We make fertilizers, which are basically this. And we pour that all over fields. A lot of that fertilizer that we pour on the field, that's good. It makes plants grow, right? It's a good thing. And too much can burn plants and kill them, right? But a lot of that fertilizer we put on the ground ends up where? It gets washed into rivers and ponds and lakes and stuff like that. All of a sudden, now there's all this nitrogen in that pond or lake that wasn't there before. Which means now what can grow that shouldn't be able to grow? Algae. Lots of algae, because Just like everything else, algae need nitrogen. And normally, there's not a crazy amount of algae growing in a pond because there's not enough what? There's not enough nitrogen in the pond. It's a limiting factor. But all of a sudden, you got a lot of nitrogen in the pond from this runoff from fertilizers. So let's say here's our pond. There weren't many algae here before. Now there's nitrogen in here. The algae start growing like crazy. Let's say this is a mat of algae. They cover up the whole surface of the pond. At first, unless you're a fisherman, you might think that'd be a good thing. Because algae do what? They do photosynthesis. And you would think that'd be good for the lake, right? You'd think it'd be good for the fish because there'd be a lot of food up here. You'd think it'd be good for the fish down here because there'd be a lot of oxygen in the water. You might think that at first. What do we call that when algae grow out of control? It's called an algal bloom. They don't bloom like a plant, just they grow out of control. But here's the deal. Turns out that's usually a bad thing. Because once they cover up the surface of the pond, what happens underneath the surface? All the plant life under there starts to die. Right? There's plants that live in the water below the water line. Those die. And also, most of the oxygen that those algae on the top make ends up where? It goes into the air, not into the water. The algae start to die. And when they die, they sink, right? What starts happening to their dead, decaying bodies below the surface? They start getting eaten, basically, by fungus and other bacteria and stuff like that, right? When you eat things, you then have to do what on the stuff you ate? What comes after eating and digestion? Before you can get energy out of what you ate, you have to do what on it? Eat, digest, and then do what? To make ATP, you have to do cellular respiration. Cellular respiration has to use what gas as a reactant? Oxygen gas. And it gives off what gas as a product? Carbon dioxide. The point being, even though there's a lot of photosynthesis going on up here, what happens to the oxygen levels down here? They drop. Because most of this oxygen is going up into the air. The plants down here on the bottom, they die because they're not getting any sunlight. And the dead algal bodies are getting cell respiration done on them here, which is using up the oxygen. What happens to the fish in that pond pretty quickly? They die because they basically suffocate. It's like those fish I talked about in my pond where they didn't have any oxygen.
I continue to see multiple young men come into this building wearing hats on their head. This is your one and only warning. When I get it, you won't get it back. So you better take that hat off your head inside this building.
We got that on tape. Anyway, this problem that I just described is called eutrophication. Eutrophication. So let me kind of define that for you. Eutrophication. It's when a body of water, it's usually either extra nitrogen or phosphorus. Both of which are components of what? Yeah, the fertilizers. Nitrogen and phosphorus, components of fertilizers. All of a sudden, this body of water has extra nitrogen or extra phosphorus. It wasn't supposed to be there. It had acted as a limiting reactant before. When it does that, when it gets that extra nutrient, the algae in that body of water go through a bloom. They reproduce out of control. That covers up the surface of the body of water. Blocks out what? Blocks out the sunlight. Kills the plants that are living underneath the surface. And therefore lowers the concentration of what in that body of water? Oxygen. And eventually leads to the death of the fish and whatever else is living in the pond. So if you see a mat of algae on the surface of a body of water, it's typically not a good thing. Even though photosynthesis is happening, the oxygen levels underneath are dropping. Because there's no plants under the water. They can't live there. No life. It's tough to get rid of. I mean, they have that problem in Scottsboro and Gunnersville a lot, right?
Like you can't kill it because they're just going to go to the bottom and the bacteria's going to eat it.
You know, in some places they tried herbicides. They poured poison in the water to kill the plant, and that's the problem, right? I mean, you don't want to eat the fish if you do that. So there's all kinds of issues it's hard to get rid of. Some places they brought in fish that eat this particular algae specifically, and they turn them loose. And that's caused problems because they've out-reproduced the normal fish like bass and stuff. It's a hard problem to deal with. Last couple of things I'll mention here.
Well, wouldn't they just limit the use of fertilizer and start using natural stuff like cow manure and stuff like that?
Well, the problem with that is that makes it a lot more expensive on farmers because they got to haul that in, they got to spread it. It's more expensive to buy in the first place, and that's going to drive up the price of food. So it's one of those economic issues where it's kind of a no-win situation for everybody. Last thing here I'll mention, most bacteria are aerobes, which means when they do cell respiration, they need what? They need oxygen. Most of them do respiration the same way we do, aerobic cellular respiration. There are some bacteria that are called obligate anaerobes. And we know that word obligate is like obligate, right? And anaerobes mean what? Means what? No oxygen. So they have to be away from oxygen. Which means they're doing what kind of respiration? So anaerobic, also sometimes called, it's another name for anaerobic cellular respiration. You've all heard of before. You all know the word. You may not know exactly what it is. You know the word. Fermentation. Fermentation. Oxygen will actually kill some of these things if they get into contact with very much oxygen. It's bad for them. And then the very last thing I'll mention for today, there are some bacteria that can take oxygen or leave it. They're called facultative anaerobes. They can deal with oxygen or they can deal without having oxygen. They can switch back and forth. What we'll talk about in the next one of these sessions is the archaea, what used to be called archaea bacteria. But that's a good place to stop for today.